Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Monday. We're just going to let everyone file into the virtual room, but while you are doing that, we would love for you to tell us in the chat where you are joining us from. So, Julie, one of our favorite things about when we meet with our members is that they are from all over the state. And we start all our events by having them introduce themselves to us and each other in the chat to let us know kind of like who's representing today.
That's amazing. I'm gonna pull up the chat so I can track this.
Hey, Debbie. Debbie Schmeeding is our voter service chair of the state board. We'll have to have you guys meet sometime. We have Mimi. Hey, Mimi, it's nice to see everybody. Adrienne, Kathleen, Columbus representing today. Pam Wilson. Hi, Pam. Well, thanks, everyone. We're going to give it another minute, and then we will get started. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I am Nazika Pasha, Policy Affairs Manager at the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And today we are really happy and excited to have some great guests with us from Disability Rights Ohio to do with us a voter service training event on serving voters with disabilities. Our guest speakers, Julie Keys and Nellie Pratt, are going to talk to us more about how we can help disability voters overcome challenges in the voter registration process and accessing the ballot. The training will touch on major highlighted barriers to voting for individuals with disability, and we will discuss how Disability Rights Ohio can be a resource to help you get voters with disabilities registered and help them access the ballot when they need to. Julie Keys is an attorney on the Civil Rights and Community Integration team at Disability Rights Ohio. She's passionate about criminal justice issues, and much of her work at DRO is focused on disability rights in jail and prison settings. Personally and professionally, Julie is also an advocate for voting rights during the last presidential election. Julie took time off to be a poll worker, and this year she's excited to be taking the lead on DRO's voter outreach in Ohio jails. We also have with us Nellie Pratt, also from Disability Rights Ohio. Nellie is an advocate on the abuse and neglect team at Disability Rights Ohio. She focuses on monitoring and investigating facilities throughout the state to ensure the residents are free of abuse and neglect. She's currently enrolled at The Ohio State University in her MSW program, focusing on community and social justice. Nellie is passionate about racial and social justice issues, abolitionist work, community engagement, and building and youth. Nellie was also a poll worker during the last presidential election and is co-lead on DRO's voter outreach in Ohio's jails. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. We have closed captioning enabled today, but you will need to enable that on your screen. So just move to the bottom, move your cursor to the bottom, and you should see this symbol where you can click on closed captioning if you would like that enabled on your screen. I want to remind all of our voter service folks that we still have voter information cards for you to order. If you would like to order any, then please just go ahead and email me and I will send you the link to do so. These are available both to local leagues and to nonprofit organizations if you would like to share this information. And we do have a limited amount of funding for organizations and local leagues to get these free of charge, depending on just letting us know how you're using these cards. Sorry, I was supposed to finish a slide there, letting you guys know that we have a training also on April 4th coming up on all things voting, registration, access to the polls, a more general training, and we'll be sending out more information about that really soon. I am going to stop sharing my screen and give the floor over to our guests, Julie and Nellie.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I don't know if it's working.
It is.
Great. We're like, you know, into well into the pandemic, and I'm still learning how to use Zoom. So it's really nice. I'd love to just show you guys the slides. Okay, did that work?
Yes.
Or is it the same view?
Nope, it's just the one slide.
Cool. Okay, well, that was a really fabulous introduction. Thank you so much. We won't be long-winded about who we are or what we do because it's been covered. I really appreciate it. We are going to cover a lot of content. We're going to do it briefly. If there's one takeaway from today, though, we want it to be that we are a resource, and to please do not hesitate to follow up with us if you have questions about anything like voter related to disability rights. So reach out to us. We love doing this work and we are a resource. We're also going to just do a quick background on who Disability Rights Ohio is and what we do, because I'm sure some of you are unfamiliar with our work. And we'll also kind of touch on the specific voting rights work that we do. And then we're going to do a quick overview, and we'd love to do a deep dive, but we're going to do a quick overview of the four most common or most major barriers that surround voting for folks who are disabled. So we will touch on those, and then our goal is to leave a good chunk of time for Q&As. So we're going to go fast. I'll monitor the chat. If there's questions as we go, please don't hesitate to throw them in there or unmute yourself and just jump in. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nellie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to get us started by just talking a little bit about who Disability Rights Ohio is and what we do. So we are the protection and advocacy agency for the state of Ohio, designated by the state to oversee a lot of different things, basically to serve individuals who have disabilities and to advocate for human, civil, and legal rights of the people with disabilities in the state of Ohio. We are client directed, which means that we are in it for our clients. We go with what our clients want. We don't go based off of what the guardian might want or their families. We also provide advocacy free of charge. So our work is also overseen by a state committee here in Ohio that was just appointed, but we are actually federally funded with federal grants, which Julie's going to get into our PAVA grant in a little bit. And then we also go by federal laws. So we actually have federal access to monitor and investigate facilities in Ohio. That's actually what I do on my team, is we go into the facilities and monitor. And part of what we do in our monitorings is advocate for people to get registered to vote as well. So we can go into different places, prisons, schools, hospitals, developmental centers, things like that. So we help people live and work in the community. We help them with educational, vocational services, help people get services and accommodations they might need, investigate abuse and neglect, exploitation. We also help work, but with Social Security and other benefits. And then we investigate Social Security rep payee issues. I also do that as part of my work. And then we do a lot of voting rights education and advocacy when voting comes up. So. And then
Yeah,
Julie's going to talk about the HAVA grant.
Yeah, so like Nellie said, we do a lot. Voting is just one of the many things that we do. So just a little background into why we do voting rights work and how we do it. The Help America Vote Act actually funds the voting access program for the protection and advocacy systems like DRO. So we do several things under the PAVA grant, including legislative advocacy, policy advocacy, outreach, and then we do a voter hotline. So an example of legislative advocacy that we would do, we've got members of our staff who monitor like voter suppression bills like HB 294. We have our eye on some of the federal bills, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So we will have staff that will monitor the movement and progress of those bills. We'll do policy advocacy. An example of what that might look like, several years ago, we wrote a letter to the controlling board in support of providing prepaid postage for absentee ballots. We felt passionate about that issue because folks with disabilities are also disproportionately low income, so it affects our clients greatly. Examples of outreach, this is like what our staff gets super excited about surrounding major elections. We kind of pick an area or a community that we think would benefit from direct outreach. During the last presidential election, we targeted our outreach on psychiatric hospitals. So we met with staff and did trainings on issues that patients at the psychiatric hospitals might face in terms of voting. This year, Nellie and I are leading our outreach efforts, and we are going to be focusing on the jails. So there's obviously a very low voter turnout in jails for a number of reasons. Mostly there's just a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding about the rights of people who are incarcerated and whether they can vote. So we're really excited to do that work. And then every year or every election day, we do a voter hotline. I'm going to throw that information up there for you all if you need it as a resource. So on election day, we will run, we basically turn all of our phones over into a hotline. It's like an all staff on deck situation, and we field calls from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. And we get a lot of interesting calls. We face a lot of different issues on election day, but some of our clients do have issues leading up to election day with early voting, absentee ballots. So our general intake line is open weekdays, and we're always fielding and willing to take calls about any voting issues that folks are seeing. Just an example of some of the most common questions. Oops, how do I go back? There we go. Some of the most common questions we'll get on our voter hotline or leading up to election day. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's just a taste of some of the misconceptions that are out there. People who are under guardianship don't know whether they're able to vote. The quick answer is yes. Having a guardian doesn't automatically make you, doesn't automatically disenfranchise you. We get a lot of calls from folks who are forensic patients at state hospitals. That was one of the reasons that we targeted our outreach last election cycle to the psychiatric hospitals, because there's a lot of, there's a lack of clarity in those community settings. Homelessness is an issue that we see a lot, people not knowing what address to put down, so we can help with that. So lots of a diversity of issues for folks with disabilities who are voting. I think a lot of people think about like accessibility issues, like folks not being able to access their polling location. Those are also questions we get a lot, issues that we work with Board of Elections about. So call our hotline. It's not just for our clients, it's for advocates who are out there doing the work too, who might have a really specific disability related question. So definitely use us as a resource. Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, we're gonna talk about some of the major barriers that folks with disabilities face when they're voting. This is actually part of our PAVA funding has funded a post-presidential election report from DRO. So we're still currently, hasn't been published yet, but it's getting very close. And it was through that work that we identified these 4 major barriers. I've just outlined them here. We're going to kind of do a deep dive, but unexpected hospitalizations are a big issue for our clients. People who are confined voters, so maybe unable to access a physical polling location. Curbside voting was immensely popular during the last presidential election, and we saw a lot of issues surrounding the accessibility of that. And then remote absentee ballot marking, which is a great tool for folks who are blind or have a visual impairment that not a lot of people know about. So I'll dive into the first barrier, which is arguably the most complicated and tedious of the barriers. And this is a huge issue that's really complicated, and I'm doing like a 2-minute overview of it. So if you have questions about this, again, we're going to leave time for a Q&A, but also feel free to follow up with us after this presentation, and we can talk about it more. So there's a rule in Ohio. If you are an eligible voter, so you're otherwise registered to vote and you qualify to register, and you are unexpectedly hospitalized, or if your minor child was unexpectedly hospitalized between noon the Saturday before the election and 3 p.m. on election day, you can submit for a special absentee ballot with your Board of Election by 3 p.m. on election day. So that's different than the regular absentee ballot deadline, which is noon the Saturday before. So these voters have a few different ways that they can vote. If you're in your county, you can have somebody from the Board of Elections come by. If you're really at the beginning of the deadline, so if you're like Saturday before election day, mail could be an option. And then you can have qualified family members help you with the process. And that's obviously a very specifically defined term, so you'll want to pay close attention to that. There are several issues that come up here. The first issue, which is not even listed, is just a general lack of education and training with hospital staffs who don't know about this process and cannot help patients navigate this complicated special ballot process. So that's one of the reasons that we targeted hospitals last presidential election, was just to improve education and training around this issue. But the noon cutoff, the Saturday at noon, obviously poses a barrier for folks who are hospitalized, who might be incapacitated, or who might have expected to be out in time to vote, who might miss these deadlines. And if we're doing a strict interpretation of this rule, if you're hospitalized at 11:59 a.m. The Saturday before election day, you technically have 1 minute to submit your absentee ballot. So the deadlines are obviously problematic. Submitting the absentee ballot is also a barrier for people who are hospitalized. If you're hospitalized in your county where you vote, a family member, again, specifically defined, can pick up your application and assist, or 2 Board of Election officials can come out and help you vote. That's great. When you're unexpectedly hospitalized, you're not always making sure that you're staying within your county. That's sort of part of what's unexpected about it. So if you're hospitalized out of county, you can still have a family member assist you, but they'll obviously have to do driving and transport and travel to accommodate that. And you can also mail the ballot, which, you know, if you're unexpectedly hospitalized at 2:59 p.m. on election day, mailing the ballot kind of defies the laws of physics, and you can't bend time to make that work in really any scenario. So there's not a lot of logical process in place, which makes this, you know, one of the biggest barriers that we've identified. If you're in a county or in a hospital that understands accommodations for people with disabilities, your Board of Elections is probably able to assist in that way. What we have suggested and what the Secretary of State has been pretty good about implementing is kind of mirroring the requirements for folks who are in the military and voting overseas. They can submit ballots and receive them via fax and email. And in the past, we've had good luck getting those accommodations for our clients who are voting this way. But there's no, and there is a special application for an out-of-county voter that does allow for these processes, but there's no like public-facing directions. You really have to be knowledgeable about this really specific way of voting to do so successfully. So we encourage people, if they have a loved one who is voting this way, or we have a client who is voting this way, just call us. We know this process inside and out. We can contact the right people to make it happen. It's so complicated that you shouldn't be expected to navigate it yourself. We're here as a resource, and we are here to make it happen. We did a lot of work surrounding this on the last election day. I'm pulling this from the report, but in November 2020, DRO directly assisted at least 8 hospitalized voters by working with the county boards and the Secretary of State to resolve these matters. So while 8 doesn't seem like, you know, it's not like a huge population of people who are facing these issues, you know, we helped 8 people perform their civic duty, and that can be really empowering. One Board of Elections did fail to deliver a ballot to multiple voters who were hospitalized that ultimately disenfranchised them. Another board explicitly refused to follow the out-of-county ADA process, and DRO stepped in, and without DRO's advocacy and involving the Secretary of State, these people would have been disenfranchised, but they were ultimately able to vote. So we think of that as a great success, but obviously there's a ton of work to do around this issue. And we hope that our outreach and our policy advocacy helps improve the process. But right now, this is a huge barrier for our clients. That was really long-winded, and I'm sorry. If you have questions about it, Kevin Truitt, our legal director, has been working on this issue for like 10 years, and he could go on and on and on about it more than I could. So always happy to connect you if you think this is an issue that you want to explore further. I'll take a break from talking and hand it over to Nellie.
I am going to talk about the second major barrier that's going to be identified in our public report, which is home and facility bound voters requesting personal ballot delivery. So the rule is that voters with disabilities who live in nursing facilities, other institutions, or at home and can't vote in person, they can have someone from the Board of Elections personally deliver and return their ballot to the Board of Elections. Voters that want to use this process have to submit a different form. It's not the absentee ballot, it's Form 11F, and it has to be received by the Board of Elections by noon on Saturday prior to Election Day. Some of the issues with this barrier are that the Board of Elections delivery of ballots to facility-bound voters is not very proactive. And also that the facility-bound in-person absentee ballot delivery with the county-to-county issue. So with the facility-bound in-person absentee ballot delivery, if a person is in a facility and that facility is out of county of residence, they are able to receive the ballot. So what would happen is the Board of Elections in the county that they are originally from would send over the ballot to the county that they are currently living in, residing in, and that then someone from Board of Elections could deliver that ballot in person. And they would be responsible then for getting the ballot back to the original county that the individual is from. And so the issue with this is there's no guidance and really no formal process. So a big barrier with this is with early voting. They could come out once, but what happens if you end up being facility bound after they come out to obtain those early ballots? They're not always going to come back to get those votes. Another takeaway from this is if the facility resident does request a valid in-person ballot delivery through this process, the 11F process, that it does have to be delivered even if they've already visited the facility. But that is with the 11F form.
Thanks, Nellie. Okay, the next major barrier that we've identified in the report is curbside voting. A lot of people were unfamiliar with curbside voting before the last presidential election, and then it was pretty heavily utilized during COVID. So the rule in Ohio is that curbside voting is available as an in-person voting method on Election Day and during early voting for voters who have disabilities and face barriers to physically accessing the polling location. So instead of physically entering the polling location, voters can stay outside and request that a poll worker deliver and return their completed paper ballot on site. And in theory, this is fantastic for several reasons, especially during COVID for people who are especially vulnerable to COVID-19, but also for physical structures that aren't necessarily easily navigable for somebody who uses a wheelchair or some other assistive device. So, but some of the issues that we found with curbside voting, again, there's no like uniform requirements county to county. That's a theme and a trend that we see with most of these barriers. And so there's no requirement for accessible signage. So we saw that a lot in Franklin County, folks showing up to early vote or vote on to early vote at the Board of Elections and just having there's not an easy way to navigate curbside voting. People just kind of showing up and calling us and saying, hey, I'm here, but like, I have no idea where to go from here, and how to get someone to come out and help me with my curbside voting. Saw that at polling locations around the state on election day too. So, and then there's also assumptions made that folks who need curbside voting are coming with other people who can physically access the polling location to go inside and say, hey, someone out here wants to curbside vote. And then there's also an assumption that if someone's not coming with other voters or someone who can run inside for them, that they have a cell phone where they can call and say, hey, I'm outside, I need to curbside vote. So those are two assumptions that are made about people who need to utilize curbside voting that can just create another barrier to accessing this accommodation. So DRO has made some suggestions for how to improve it. And it would start with signage and perhaps having people stationed outside who can assist people who need to use this voting method.
The last major barrier that we're going to talk about is remote absentee ballot marking. The rule for this barrier says that voters with vision impairments and other print disabilities can request an absentee ballot using a special form. They can then have their ballot emailed to them. They can complete it, print the ballot using their own computer accessibility software, and return the ballot to the Board of Elections. The issues with this barrier is that it is underutilized and it is a separate and confusing process. So in this process, it allows voters with disabilities who maybe they don't want someone to go with them to help them vote. They can vote privately and independently and don't have to utilize that help. So all Ohio County Board of Elections are required to provide this to voters with disabilities. But there are uniform statewide requirements for them to carry out this process. So you do have to have a printer. There should be a way for you to verify it on the computer, however, and then the envelope that is sent with it is going to have holes in it telling you where to sign. And the instructions do get explained on the electronic ballot. So this process was a result of litigation that DRO participated in and represented an individual and worked with the National Federation of the Blind. And those are the 4 major barriers that are going to be identified in the public report that we are still working on, but almost ready to publish. So
that was a lot of information. And we managed to present it as quickly as we possibly could. But I'm sure that leaves you with some questions. Are people posting questions in the chat? Should I pull that up? Okay.
Hey, Julie, thanks so much to Julie and Nellie for your presentation. That was a lot of information. So I know I speak for others when I say that we're looking forward to seeing the report when it comes out. My first question actually about the report is, does it have policy suggestions that voter advocates can use to advocate on behalf of disabled people, like as a guide to know more than just what are the problems, but what are the possible solutions?
Yes, that is a major guiding principle of DRO. We don't want to identify issues without coming up with solutions. So the report is very detailed in what the issues are, but also makes several recommendations for each barrier. I think that's probably where we are still, why we haven't published yet, is we want to make sure that proposed remedies are feasible. But yeah, yes, absolutely. We are making suggestions. And as soon as that report is public facing, I'm going to send it directly to you all for you to circulate so that you do have those talking points and those ideas that Ohio could utilize to make things more accessible.
That's awesome. And just so all of you know, we will have that on the voting and elections section of our website as soon as Julie sends that to me. Thank you, Julie.
Of course.
So we've got several questions. I'm going to dive right into them. Our first question is, how does someone with ALS vote from where if they cannot even make an X? So someone with any kind of severe disability, are there further accommodations for those people?
Yes. So one question that we get frequently is, can somebody come with me to vote and can they help me? And are there time limits in the voting booths? So, so if you're physically going to a polling location on election day, you can bring someone with you to help you. And that person can be anybody that you choose to bring with you, like a family or friend. And then if you don't want to vote in front of somebody you know, you can also get assistance from 2 poll workers from each party. That process has been in place and is pretty universal. I saw it personally utilized at the polling location that I worked last year, and it worked really well for the people who needed to utilize it. There's also, if you have a disability, there's no time limit for the amount of time that you can spend in the voting booth. Typically, there's a 10-minute limit if there's a line of voters, but if you have a disability, the accommodation is that there's no time limit. Folks can also, utilize absentee ballots, but yeah, I mean, there's, in terms of making voting as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, there's a really long way to go. I think it's really promising that for folks who are blind or have visual impairments, there's an electronic method that can be utilized. And I'm hopeful and curious to see if that's expanded, because I do think that it would make voting more accessible for more people.
So you touch on the topic of if a person has a disability at a polling location.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of requirement that a person shows proof that they are disabled, or would they just say, I'm disabled? Like, what if they have a apparent disability, like an intellectual disability?
No, you don't have to. You would have to make the request for the accommodation. And that's it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Connie Rubin asked, I think you touched on a part of this, but is DRO funded by the state of Ohio, and do you have local agencies in the state?
Yeah, so DRO is federally funded. So we get our funding from federal grants. There is a state law that is in place that requires that the governor appoint an agency to be the protection and advocacy system to receive that federal funding. And under that statute, the governor has designated Disability Rights Ohio to be that organization. And so through our federal funding, we also have access to a lot of different places, but we're a statewide entity, so we can go into pretty much any facility that provides services to people with disabilities. So we operate all around the state. We go into nursing homes, jails, youth facilities, residential treatment facilities, all over the state, and can do so through that federal funding.
Okay, so what I'm understanding, just to be clear, is that you yourself are more of an advocacy agency, not like a physical place social service agency.
Right, we are not, yeah, and we are not an arm of the government. We are a nonprofit agency, so we're not a state agency.
Okay, great. So Bill Davis asks, there are a couple group homes in my area. How do we reach out to places like that where people are not usually seen outside their home and their caregivers do not or cannot take them to the polls? These situations seem like prime opportunities for absentee ballots.
Yes, completely agree, and completely agree that they probably are not provided with a lot of information about how to vote. In that instance, if there's like a specific location that you think could benefit from more information, you could use Disability Rights Ohio as a resource, reach out to our intake team, and we would be happy to send like self-help materials to folks who live there with information about how to request. They would probably be eligible for the confined voter absentee ballot, which is that 11F form that we talked about. Or just, they could also use the absentee, the regular absentee ballot forms. So that's part of our job under this PAVA grant, is to do outreach to people who need it. So again, if you have a loved one or know of people who are in these group homes that could use this information, please contact us, and we would love to share information. We try to target facilities or homes that we think have been underrepresented in terms of voter outreach. And so that's why we're focusing on the jails this year, but that doesn't mean that we can only do outreach in the jails. We're happy to target certain facilities that you think could benefit.
Julie, many of our local leagues do outreach, community outreach in a number of different kinds of locations, schools, community centers. I think there might be a little bit of apprehension from some folks about going into centers or homes where there might be a disability community, or maybe even an elderly disability community. Do you feel like there's anything that our local leagues particularly should keep in mind when they are trying to do educational events or just distributing materials to those types of places?
Yeah, Nellie, you might be able to better answer this because you do a lot of monitoring at various facilities.
Yeah, I can touch on this.
Yeah,
so we have actually just now started going back into facilities. We have been throughout the pandemic, dependent upon the facility, but now we're really just starting to go back out. And a lot of the mask mandates have been lifted. And in regards to COVID, just keeping in mind that people with disabilities are more susceptible to catch COVID and die from it. And then also, if we're talking about the elderly population, we do monitor a lot of nursing homes. So just keeping in mind that they have that extra level of vulnerability to any kind of sickness. So I know that DRO, when we're going to facilities, we are definitely still wearing at least a KN95 mask. A lot of the facilities have lifted their mask mandates as well. And keep in mind too that a lot of times the facilities themselves aren't going to have any kind of mandates like masking or anything like that in place for the residents. So having that layer of protection, even for yourself in those high risk settings, is a good idea. We have noticed that with vaccination rates, the residents tend to be pretty high. I would say most facilities resident vaccination rates are going to be around 70% or higher. But then when you look at the vaccination rates for staff, it's significantly lower. I would say the average would be around 40%. of staff members are vaccinated at these facilities. And luckily the COVID numbers have gone down in a lot of facilities, but that still, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be masking up or putting, trying to protect those with disabilities, and especially the elderly population with disabilities as well. So.
Thank you, Nellie. We have a question from Jay Shah, who is with WKSU. He says, for people with sight issues that may not have a trustworthy or reliable person to bring with them to the polls, how can they ensure that the person helping them won't try to deceive them and pick their preferred candidate over the disabled person?
That's a good question. And that's an issue, obviously, that lots of people with disabilities would face when voting, if they're relying on somebody to help them execute the ballot. I will say the rules do allow you to bring in to bring somebody with you to vote. So you could choose somebody that you trust. Alternatively, if you don't have that or you don't feel comfortable, the rule is that one designated person from each political party accompanies that person to the poll and helps execute the ballot. So the idea is that since each party is represented, it would cut down on voter fraud or influence of any sort. But yeah, it's obviously, it's not a perfect system at all. I can absolutely, I would not want to vote in front of other people either. So it's not ideal, but yeah, hopefully somebody would either have somebody that they trust to take in with them, or would trust the, two-party system.
Thanks, Julie. Andrew Cohn asks, does someone in a group home use that address for voter registration purposes?
Yes, they would. That would be their residence. Yep.
Okay, great. And Matina Bliss asks, is there a process for educating students with disabilities about their voting rights and the voting process? Has DRO had success providing this information directly to students through schools?
That's a good question. And Nellie, you might know more than I know, but we have an entire education team. So a whole team of lawyers and advocates who work just in the education setting. I'm not on that team, so I can't speak to the work that they're doing. In terms of our PAVA work, I don't know if we've done targeted outreach in the school settings. I think it's a great idea. I know when I was 17 years old, registering to vote, I was super excited about these topics. So I'm sure that it would be a really productive place to go do that outreach. I will say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I can jump in too.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I do not think that targeting schools has been something that we have been concerned with voting. I unfortunately think that in schools, voting is probably the least of like the concern that we actually see on the education team. I know the education team ends up dealing a lot with like violation of IEP rules and abuse and neglect issues within the schools as well. There's also, but I do think it's a great idea, and I actually will bring it up in a couple of the meetings that I am a part of, that we are with the education team, where we're targeting schools for different things. Because one of the things that we're really working on right now as well with the Board of Education and different districts around the state is talking about supported decision making. And so that can also play a lot into voting and an individual's right to vote. And I know a lot of times when you are stuck in under a guardian, you do have that concept of, oh, I can't vote. I have a guardian. They said I can't vote. And maybe, because you're disenfranchised, not questioning that. I will bring it up to the Supported Decision Network of Ohio and kind of talk to them about doing some more outreach in schools with voting.
Thank you, Nellie. And I'll just mention also, I've met Martina once before on a call, and she is in the leadership of, I think the organization is called Kids Vote Ohio, or Kids Voting Ohio. So I would say that there's a connection to be made there. Kids Voting Ohio. Yeah, so definitely, I know that she can help you in terms of strategies to get into schools and working with kids specifically.
Great, thanks. That's awesome.
We have a few questions around absentee ballots and voters who cannot physically sign a ballot. Is there any way to work around that? Can somebody who cannot physically sign a ballot vote with an absentee ballot?
Yeah, so as an accommodation, you can have somebody assist you in marking your ballot. That's true at the polling location too, like we just covered. There are certain people by law who it cannot be. It can't be your employer, an agent of your employer, or if you're in a union, it can't be someone in your union, and it can't be a candidate. So, the language says that you can have someone assist you in marking the ballot, and I think by logic that would extend to the signature portion. So yeah, there's an accommodation there.
Thank you so much. And Bill Davis asked if for groups or individuals that want to go into homes or centers for folks with disabilities, where would you get a list how would you be able to access a list of such places?
It's a great question. Nellie, do you know? how do you know where to go?
So we know where to go because we get the lists from places like OMAS, Board of DD, but I don't know if I can answer the question because with our access authority, I am not sure if we know just because we have access to those facilities and where their licensing bodies are and who they're under and our access authority, or if that is public information. But we can definitely find the answer to that question and get it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nellie. You can get back to me with that information, and any local leagues who want to reach out to homes or centers that serve disability populations, reach out to me, I don't know, in another week or 2 weeks, and we'll see if we have any additional information on that. I've gotten a few questions on curbside voting. Are there requirements for curbside voting? How do you know what those requirements are?
Yeah, yes, there are requirements. Curbside voting has to be available, and that is as the Secretary of State's office should have those policies and procedures laid out very clearly, since it is a county, like every county, every polling location needs to make curbside voting available, especially when there's like a physical barrier to accessing the building. So not every polling location is in what we would call like an ADA accessible building with like a ramp or some other, physical accessibility. And that's where curbside voting becomes like really crucial. But yes, the short answer is that this is a statewide policy, and the Secretary of State should, in theory, have lots of information about how it works. Where we are seeing barriers, though, is that although curbside voting is available, there's not necessarily uniform requirements for communicating that accommodation. So we see a lack of signage, a lack of information posted at polling locations that tell people how to utilize the accommodation. And that's where we think there's a lot of room for improvement, is communicating that this exists and how to utilize the accommodation.
And is it available to whoever requests it, or do you have to show some kind of disability? In the last version of the election official manual that came out, I know that there was some language around who can access curbside voting. Do you know what the final policy on that is?
I don't, and I don't want to speak to it because there was this huge debate during the last presidential election, and I think, like most things during that election, it remained pretty confusing. With COVID, ideally anybody who is immunocompromised or is otherwise particularly vulnerable to COVID and being in a large communal setting with people could utilize curbside voting. And I don't know, I was surprised, just speaking anecdotally, when I was a poll worker during the November election, I was surprised that it wasn't more utilized as an accommodation for people who do have disabilities that made them, more vulnerable. And I think that is a product of a lack of communication about who can utilize curbside voting and how to use it. So I want to say that anybody who requests the accommodation can get it. You don't have to prove a disability to get an accommodation. But I don't know exactly where the Secretary of State came down on it.
Yeah, I'll just say that the last version of the election official manual that came out, the language was kind of vague in there. I read the proposed directive, and I didn't read what came out after that, for those that are asking that question. But I will say that, and I don't know, it seems, Julie, that this is kind of a theme. It's kind of vague, the language, and it's up to 88 different county BOEs to interpret it as they want to interpret it. And I think oftentimes, interpretation falls not only to the person, but they're going to interpret it depending on the resources that they have. And so whether that be for early voting or polling locations, I would be careful about, you might have somebody try to access something like that at a polling location that is busy, where they might be trying to make some excuses. And so Shelley, I see your question. I'll try to pull that language for you specifically, but I would say that language is accessible in the election official manual on the Secretary of State's website. And there was a new one that was published this year. So look for the new language on that.
Yeah.
And with that, we are coming up on the hour. So I am going to wrap up here and say thank you so much to our guests, Julie Keys and Nellie Pratt from Disability Rights Ohio. We have recorded this webinar. We will have it up on our YouTube page. It is chock full of information, and I am sure that so many people have benefited and will benefit from this. Thank you so much to the both of you, and thank you for everyone that attended today, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much. And I'll say I threw my email in the chat. So if anybody has a question or a follow-up, please feel free to reach out directly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.